as part of the closure and feeding into that report, you should have a post-implementation review, and that is where we look at all components of our project and look for opportunities for continuous improvement. It feeds into, of course, what I've just been talking about with lessons learned, but we may just from a PIR perspective take a broader look, have a look at the phase that we used, the different phases or stages we used for the project, the methodology that we used, the milestones that we set, the planning. Was it sufficiently detailed? Was it too detailed? Was our risk management framework appropriate? Was our plan sufficient? Did our treatments work? Was the review and monitoring process sufficient? Was the skill mix good? Were we flexible enough? We should be looking at all those components of our project and evaluating what worked well and what didn't work so well. And as I said earlier, your lessons learned will drop out of that. This is important, and I know I've said this a couple of times now, but this is important for adding to the body of knowledge, and it's one of those things that we do to pay forward. So the PIR doesn't necessarily have any causal impact or influence on your current project, but you're paying that forward for any future projects that are similar. You're actually hoping to use the benefit of your experience to help to inform the decisions being made in the future. So a critical component of that is obviously gathering data, looking at all your metrics that you've been able to, you look at your baseline, the metrics you've been able to gather through the project and comparing it and so forth. And also importantly, making sure that you gather that qualitative stuff from key project team members. If you've got quality teams, so that could be internal other teams within your organization. Can be things like contractors or suppliers, and depending on the nature of what you do, it might be one-on-one interviews and discussions, maybe Q&A sessions. You may go for a more quantitative evaluation, like using something like a Likert scale on different metrics, or you might have a more qualitative focus group type of approach where you might get smaller groups together and talk about the experience and so forth. Again, the mix of that will depend on the nature of the project and the workspace that you're working in and so forth. But this is really important in terms of having those two dimensions, the quantitative stuff, which will be led by the data and the data of performance against your baseline and and so forth, but the qualitative stuff as well. What were people's experience within that? And just to sort of tie off on what I was talking about with lessons learned earlier, this my best tip around lessons learned is not to do it at the end of the project, even though I've been talking about it as being part of the report and something that can also be done as part of that wrap up, the celebrating the success and so forth. It should be a process, even though you can do all those things, it should be a process that starts pretty much from early on. So, it's just starting a file or some type of repository of information where you can start to gather info about things that you might do differently next time. So as you're coming up with challenges or barriers or problems, you can put that aside to say, look, that's going to add to our lessons learned database in the final assessment of the project. So, and as I mentioned, for any of these things, a post-implementation review to be effective, it needs to be future-focused. It needs to be very much about what we can do in the future, very much around how it's going to influence decision-making in the future. It needs to be open and honest. It needs to be objective, of course. It needs to be objective and factual. But as part of that, it also needs to be, if it's objective and factual, then we can be confident to be open and honest without fear of retribution or blame. Things get a bit tricky when we start to make it personal. So you make personal judgments, say, the project manager was useless, or I had little support from my sponsor through the project, then yeah, that's going to be a little bit tricky, and there's probably going to be a bit of a political fallout from those kind of statements. But if you maintain your assessment to be objective and say, communication, at some point, there was a gap in communication between the project manager and the sponsor, and our recommendation would be more regular contact points, then that's a fairly objective statement, and it doesn't really address any of the personalities or makes blaming statements towards individuals. So that's something that you could put in there and know that it's not going to be well, it shouldn't be a target for retribution or blame. So and it needs to be well balanced. So as part of that, you need to make sure that it's not too negative and it's not too overly positive, that it's well balanced, that we recognize the things that we did really well, but we can also honestly and objectively recognize the things that we can do better. And then that goes into what I've been talking about in terms of our knowledge base. What was successful, what was unsuccessful, what would we do again next time, what would we do different, what would we avoid? And you can even break it down into specific areas such as consultation issues or communication issues, resource issues, any planning issues, skills or team dynamic issues or shortages, or anything else that was specific to political landscape and so forth that may be specific to your project.